The clock on the wall clicked twice. 2 in the morning. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, tracing the jagged edges where the wallpaper had curled away from the plaster. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator through the wall. She turned her head. Stacked against the baseboards were 20 cardboard boxes, each taped shut and marked with a black felt pen. They took up nearly every inch of floor space, leaving only a narrow path from the door to her bed. She looked at the boxes, then back at the peeling wall. The air in the room felt heavy, stagnant with the scent of dust and trapped potential. She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked a slow circle around the small space. Every step echoed against the bare floorboards. She reached out and pressed her palm against the top of a box, feeling the rough, corrugated texture under her skin. This was the entirety of her world, a few square feet of peeling paint and cardboard. She stood there, motionless, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor, waiting for the rest of her life to begin. She pulled the folding table closer and lifted the lid of the secondhand laptop. The screen flickered, washing the room in a harsh, cold blue light that made the peeling wallpaper look gray. She navigated to her bank portal. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic pulse, before the balance appeared on the screen. It was a low, stagnant number that had not moved in weeks. She clicked away, opening a social media tab. The screen filled with faces of people she knew, their lives curated into a stream of bright offices and travel photos. Each image was a high-definition testament to success. She scrolled faster, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. The gap between those polished, thriving careers and her own cramped, silent reality felt like a physical weight pulling at her chest. She pushed the laptop away, but the screen stayed bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the cardboard boxes. She sat back, her breath hitching as the numbers from the bank account burned into her mind. There was no margin for error. Every cent was accounted for in the tight, narrow math of her survival. She stared at the blue glare until her eyes ached, waiting for a way out that was not yet there. The next evening, Isabella stood in a brightly lit dressing room, helping a friend prepare for an upscale gala. The space was cluttered with high-end beauty products, their gold-embossed containers arranged in a precise line on the vanity. Her friend reached for a heavy cream, applying it with quick, rhythmic motions to her face. Within minutes, the friend paused, her fingers hovering over her cheek. She winced, dabbing at a patch of reddened, irritated skin that had suddenly flared beneath the product. She reached for a wet cloth, trying to wipe the residue away, but the redness persisted, spreading toward her jawline. Isabella leaned in, her gaze fixed on the reaction. She watched the friend struggle with the thick, cloying texture of the cream, noting the way it sat on the surface of the skin rather than absorbing. The friend tossed the container into the trash, complaining of the stinging heat. Isabella picked up the discarded bottle, turning it over to read the list of harsh chemical additives printed in minuscule text. She set the bottle back down. The room was noisy, filled with the sound of zippers and hurried conversation, but Isabella focused only on the physical evidence of the failed product. The irritation was a clear signal. She did not see a ruined makeup look. She saw a specific, solvable flaw. The seed of a solution took root in that moment, sharp and clear. Isabella cleared the kitchen table, pushing aside old mail and empty containers to make room for a row of glass beakers. She laid out her raw ingredients, oils in unlabeled jars, powdered extracts, and distilled water. She began the work. She measured, poured, and stirred until the liquid reached a specific viscosity. The first batch turned into a thick, clumpy paste that smelled of burnt wood. She scraped it into the sink, the residue staining the basin. She wiped the counter, recalibrated her measurements, and started again. The second attempt was too oily. The third was too thin. She tracked every ratio in a notebook, noting the temperature of the water and the exact millisecond she added the emulsifier. Her skin became her primary test site. She applied the samples to the inside of her wrist, watching for reactions, feeling for how the substance absorbed into the pores. She repeated this for hours, the kitchen air growing heavy with the scent of organic oils. The clutter of beakers and scent samples grew until the counter space was almost gone. She did not stop for food or rest. Every failure was a data point. Every successful absorption was a breakthrough. The kitchen no longer looked like a domestic space. It was a workshop where she forced the ingredients to yield to her design. Isabella moved her workspace from the kitchen to the bedroom, She set the laptop on the folding table, the screen casting a harsh blue glow against the peeling wallpaper. She opened a browser and loaded a tutorial on web development. She typed a line of code, watched the screen flicker, and saw a broken layout. She deleted the line and tried again. The cursor blinked, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the silence of the room. She spent hours deconstructing the interface, learning how to link pages, how to build a cart, and how to format a product catalog. A syntax error forced her to backtrack through 3 pages of work, and she spent 20 minutes tracing the mistake until the page rendered correctly. As the site took shape, she stopped seeing the 4 walls around her. She looked at the screen and saw a flow of orders coming in from distant cities. She saw a supply chain, a customer database, and a global distribution center. The bedroom was no longer a place to sleep. It was a digital nerve center. She clicked the final button to save her progress, the code locking into place. The website was live. She leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight, and stared at the digital storefront she had built from scratch. Isabella needed the products to look like they belonged on a high-end shelf, not a folding table. She cleared the bedroom floor, pulling a white sheet taut against the wall and securing the corners with heavy books. She placed a single jar in the center of the illuminated space. The first few shots were flat, the shadows harsh and unnatural. She shifted the lamp, adjusted the angle, and moved the jar by millimeters. She crouched low, holding her breath to keep the camera steady, waiting for the light to hit the glass without creating a glare. Each time she snapped a photo, she reviewed the screen, checking the clarity of the label and the texture of the cream visible through the jar. She repositioned the sheet to eliminate a wrinkle, then spent 10 minutes adjusting the focus. She repeated this for every jar in her inventory. She spent hours repeating the process, refining the framing until the images looked crisp and intentional. She transferred the files to her laptop, cropped the edges, and uploaded them to the site. The gallery populated, transforming the empty digital space into a catalog. She scrutinized the display, comparing the digital version to the physical jars on the floor. The transition was complete. She had manufactured the visual authority she needed to sell her work. The notification pinged at midnight. Isabella sat up, the laptop fan whirring in the quiet room. She clicked the browser tab. A new order had arrived from 3 states away, a name she did not recognize. A stranger had found her site, evaluated the images, and committed money to the product she had mixed in her kitchen. She read the address twice, her pulse spiking. She moved to the cardboard boxes, selecting the best jar from her inventory. She wrapped it in protective paper, taping the edges with precision. She pulled a pen from her desk and wrote a note on a small card, thanking the customer for their trust. She did not wait for morning. She pulled on her boots and stepped out into the rain. The streetlights reflected in the dark puddles as she walked to the post office drop box. The cold air hit her face, but she barely felt it. She slid the package through the slot. The metal flap clanged shut, a final, definitive sound. She stood there for a moment in the drizzle, listening to the silence of the street, realizing that the experiment had just become a business. She turned back toward her building, her pace quick and purposeful. The inbox remained silent for days. Isabella refreshed the browser every hour, but the screen displayed the same empty dashboard. The momentum she felt after the first shipment stalled, leaving her with 20 boxes and a mounting sense of urgency. She sat at the folding table until the sun rose, staring at the text on her website. She deleted paragraphs she had written weeks ago, replacing them with sharper, more direct language. She searched for reasons why the traffic stopped, clicking through every link and testing the checkout process repeatedly. It worked perfectly, yet the orders did not come. The silence of the room became heavy. She poured another cup of cold coffee and opened her email client, drafting messages to potential customers who had visited but never purchased. She typed until her fingers cramped, adjusting the tone, refining the call to action, and stripping away anything that sounded like a plea. She did not sleep. She spent the hours between midnight and dawn analyzing why her copy failed to convert. She printed her marketing materials, marked them with a red pen, and started over. She refused to accept the stagnant numbers. She worked the keyboard, iterating on every sentence, determined to force the market to notice her work through sheer, relentless persistence. The first wave of feedback arrived in short, blunt emails. Isabella printed every message and pinned them to the wall above her folding table. She read them until the ink blurred. One customer found the moisturizer too heavy. Another requested a lighter scent. She did not take the critique as a failure. She moved the laptop aside and cleared the surface for her beakers. She spent the next 3 nights adjusting her formulas, measuring grams of oil and water, and timing the cooling process with a stopwatch. She recorded every change in a ledger, tracking how each ratio altered the consistency. When she found a blend that absorbed without residue, she updated the website. She adjusted her pricing to reflect the new quality, calculating the cost of every drop to ensure the numbers were sustainable. She tested the new batches on her own skin, logging the results in a notebook. Her bedroom became a miniature production line of constant refinement. She was no longer guessing. She was building a product dictated by the market. She updated the product descriptions, stripping away the excess, and focused on the benefits users actually craved. Every night was a cycle of testing, adjusting, and shipping. The room was a mess of labels and jars, but the feedback loop was finally working. She had transformed the space from a storage room into a precise laboratory. The delivery arrived on a Friday afternoon. Isabella dragged the heavy box into the bedroom and sliced the tape. The sound of shifting glass followed a sharp, unmistakable chime of destruction. She pulled back the flaps. Nearly half of the bottles were reduced to jagged shards and fine dust. The impact of the loss hit her instantly. That order represented a significant portion of her remaining capital. She stood over the box, listening to the silence of the room, and looked at her bank balance on the laptop screen. It was a clear, sharp threat to her survival. She did not walk away. She grabbed a broom, swept the mess into a bin, and cleared the workspace. She spent the next 48 hours ignoring sleep and caffeine, scouring online trade directories for a manufacturer with better packing protocols. She sent dozens of inquiries, comparing quotes and demanding proof of durability. By Sunday evening, she had found a supplier who used reinforced dividers and protective padding. She placed the order, committing the last of her emergency funds. She had turned a potential ending into a necessary upgrade. She reorganized the shelf space, prepared for the new shipment, and kept moving forward, refusing to let a broken supply chain break her business. Isabella poured her remaining budget into a targeted ad campaign. She watched the dashboard, waiting for the surge of traffic. It never came. By the 3rd day, the spend had climbed, but the conversion rate remained flat. The numbers on the screen were a countdown. Every click that did not result in a sale felt like a physical weight against her chest. She adjusted the headlines, refreshed the images, and modified the targeting criteria, but the results stayed stagnant. She was burning through capital that was meant to sustain her for months. She stood up, paced the length of the room, and returned to the desk, staring at the analytics until her eyes burned. The patterns were hidden in the data, not in the images. She began to map out user journeys, tracking every drop-off point where potential buyers turned away. She cross-referenced the time of day, the referral sources, and the landing page bounce rates. It was a grueling, clinical autopsy of her own work. She realized her messaging was missing the mark entirely. She stopped trying to force the current campaign to work and started rebuilding the logic from the ground up, committed to mastering the mechanics of the market or losing the business entirely. The analytics dashboard finally turned green. The sales volume climbed steadily, crossing the threshold of her part-time job income on a Tuesday morning. It was not a sudden explosion, but a consistent, grinding momentum. Every order required packing, labeling, and a trip to the post office. Her bedroom had become a logistical bottleneck. Cardboard boxes were stacked to the ceiling, leaving only a narrow path from the door to the desk. She could no longer store inventory and work in the same space. She spent the afternoon scouting locations, finding a climate-controlled storage unit 3 blocks away. She spent the next 2 days moving her entire operation. She carried heavy crates down the stairs, loaded them into her car, and organized the new space with precision. The unit was stark, white, and silent. She set up her folding table in the center, arranged her jars in neat, numbered rows, and stood back to look at the room. She was no longer a hobbyist in a bedroom. The rent for the unit was a fixed cost, a new layer of pressure, but it was also a sign of permanence. She grabbed a fresh shipping box, packed an order, and walked out of the unit with the stride of someone who had finally claimed their own territory. The storage unit was meant to be the final answer, but the market had other plans. Orders piled up on the concrete floor, faster than she could seal the boxes. She worked past midnight, tape dispenser clattering in the silence, but the queue of pending shipments only grew. She realized that trying to do everything herself was no longer an investment in quality, it was a ceiling on her growth. She signed the lease for a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district the following week. It was vast, echoing, and intimidatingly empty. She brought in long workbenches and pallet racks, then placed an ad for help. The first employee arrived on a Tuesday. Isabella did not just hand over a packing list. She stood at the primary station, showing the new hire how to wrap the jars, how to fold the tissue paper, and how to write the thank you notes that had become her signature. She watched the employee replicate her movements, correcting a hand placement here, slowing a pace there. She was transferring her standards into another person, building a system that could function without her constant presence. By the end of the day, the warehouse floor was organized. The shipment was ready for pickup, and Isabella stepped back to see the operation running through hands other than her own. The growth did not go unnoticed. Within weeks, the digital marketplace shifted. Isabella opened her browser one morning to find 3 new listings appearing under her primary search terms. They used similar naming conventions, identical packaging color palettes, and sold at half her retail price. She clicked through the pages. The photos were crisp, the descriptions mimicked her own tone, but the ingredient lists were diluted. It was a calculated attempt to siphon her customer base. The impact was immediate. Her daily order volume plateaued, then dipped. She spent the next 48 hours mapping the competition, tracking their ad spend, and analyzing their shipping speeds. They were moving fast, attempting to flood the market before she could react. She pulled her sales data, compared it against the new arrivals, and looked for the cracks in their strategy. They had the scale and the capital, but they lacked the specific formulation precision that kept her customers coming back. She sat at her desk, marking up a whiteboard with their weaknesses, refusing to let the noise of the market distract her from the core quality of her product. The threat was real, but she held the advantage of the original. She reached for her phone to call her supplier, her plan already forming. Isabella stopped watching the copycats and started watching her inbox. She filtered thousands of customer messages, looking for the specific gaps the cheap alternatives ignored. One trend emerged: a demand for a more concentrated formula for sensitive skin. She bypassed the slow, bureaucratic approval processes used by her rivals. She spent the next 72 hours in the lab, iterating on ingredient ratios until the consistency was perfect. She didn't wait for a quarterly launch window. She finalized the formula, sourced the raw materials, and moved to production before the competition even finished their initial market research. She updated her website, sent a direct email to her top customers, and opened pre-orders within the week. The response was immediate. Her loyal base bypassed the bargain alternatives entirely, choosing the performance they trusted. While the competitors were still struggling to replicate her original product, she was already releasing the next generation. She watched the sales analytics climb, the lines spiking upward as the orders flooded in. She didn't just maintain her market share, she expanded it. By the time the copycat brands realized their mistake, their shelves were filled with outdated goods, and Isabella was already 6 months ahead, testing the next requested line. The momentum became unstoppable. Isabella pivoted from local distribution to a global logistical network. She secured partnerships with international shipping firms, transforming her small-scale supply chain into a web that reached across oceans. Every morning, she reviewed shipping logs from warehouses in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. She spent months negotiating customs regulations and navigating the complexities of international trade laws. The warehouse space tripled, then quadrupled, filled with inventory destined for 5 continents. She oversaw the hiring of regional managers, training them to maintain the same rigorous quality standards she had established in her original kitchen. Critics who once dismissed her as a hobbyist now tracked her quarterly growth reports with silence. Her products appeared on shelves from high-end boutiques in Paris to major retail chains in North America. She managed the time zones, the currency fluctuations, and the demands of a multinational customer base. The bedroom where she once mixed ingredients in solitude was now a distant memory, replaced by a sprawling infrastructure. She held the global sales maps, watching the red pins multiply across every major market. The strategy was no longer about survival. It was about defining the industry standard. She had successfully scaled the vision, proving that the foundation built in that cramped room could support an empire. Isabella stood motionless against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Below, the city was a sprawling grid of neon arteries and pulsing traffic, a million lives moving in rhythm with the night. She rested a hand against the pane, feeling the chill of the surface. It was a long way from the peeling wallpaper and the single folding table that once occupied her corner. She watched a distant intersection, the lights blurring into a haze that reminded her of the hazy, sleepless nights she spent hand-labeling jars. The silence of the office was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control. She looked down at her own reflection in the glass, superimposed over the glowing skyscrapers. The contrast was sharp. The luxury was real, but the memory of the cramped, damp bedroom was more vivid. She could still recall the smell of the raw ingredients and the sound of the rain hitting the window as she walked to the post office. She wasn't just observing the city. She was measuring it against the distance she had traveled. Every light in the skyline represented a possibility she had once been told was impossible. She took a breath, turned away from the panoramic view, and prepared for the next arrival. The office door clicked open. A young woman stepped inside, holding a thin leather portfolio. She walked to the center of the room, her eyes darting between the expansive skyline and the minimalist furniture. She pulled out a chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the wood. She looked at Isabella, her posture rigid, shoulders pulled tight. She opened the portfolio, then closed it again without pulling out a single page. She spoke, her voice barely rising above the hum of the ventilation. She asked if her ideas were enough to survive the market. She looked at her own hands, then back at the vast, empty space of the office, as if the sheer scale of the surroundings made her own ambitions feel hollow. Isabella stepped away from the window, the movement slow and deliberate. She watched the girl, noting the rapid pulse visible at her throat. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer a space of cold glass and high finance. It was a space of transition. Isabella walked toward the desk, her expression unreadable, and stopped directly across from the visitor. The girl looked up, waiting for a verdict on her worth. Isabella reached out, her hand hovering over the desk, and prepared to answer the question that had defined her own life. Isabella did not answer with a lecture. Instead, she reached into the drawer and pulled out a clean, blank notepad. She slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped inches from the girl's trembling hands. The paper was stark white, devoid of any lines or pre-printed grids. Isabella leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. She spoke with a calm, steady rhythm. "The world does not pay for thoughts," she said. "It does not care about what you imagine in the dark." She pointed to the empty page. "It pays for the courage to build what you see." She described the folding table in the corner of her old room, the way it wobbled under the weight of the boxes, and the sound of the laptop fan struggling against the heat. She told the girl that she had no capital, no team, and no blueprint for the future. She had only the physical act of mixing ingredients and the refusal to stop when the bottles arrived cracked. She watched the girl stare at the blank notepad, the realization settling in. Isabella waited for the shift in the girl's posture. The moment the doubt began to harden into a resolve to start building, the young entrepreneur kept her gaze fixed on the blank notepad, her fingers tracing the sharp, clean edges of the paper. She looked up, her breathing steady, the uncertainty in her eyes replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She nodded once, a quick, decisive motion. Isabella stood, the chair sliding back against the floor with a low, controlled sound. She walked past the desk, crossed the length of the room, and placed her hands against the cool, firm surface of the glass. Beyond the window, the city lights stretched toward the horizon, a vast grid of human endeavor. She looked down at the streets where her first packages had been carried through the rain. The empire was not held together by bank accounts or corporate structures. It was forged in the silence of a room that once felt too small, built layer by layer through the stubborn refusal to accept limits. She watched the reflection of the office in the glass, seeing the girl behind her already standing, already moving. Isabella turned her head, her gaze lingering on the city. It started with a vision, hardened into a plan, and was fueled by years of relentless, sleepless action. The work was never finished.